Hey gang, thank you very much for joining me at 2 Texas Lobsters React. My lobster is not here. She's back home in Texas, where I'm originally from, and she is taking care of things back home while I'm on assignment in Omaha, Nebraska, on a nursing assignment for 13 weeks. So you're going to meet her in about 6 weeks. I cannot wait. She is wonderful. I think you're really going to enjoy her insight on things. Today we got a great video that was recommended by one of my subscribers, IKVetch. Thank you very much. Please keep those suggestions coming, and I will get on to your ideas and suggestions as soon as I possibly can. Today, we're going to talk about Prohibition. And Prohibition not only happened in the United States, where it caused a lot of trouble. It actually, it was instituted by the 18th Amendment. It was ratified by the Volstead Act in 1919, so from 1920 to 1932-33, we had the Prohibition, which prohibited the creation, the transportation, and the selling of alcohol in this country. In 1933, it was undone by the U.S. government because they couldn't tax alcohol anymore because there was no alcohol to be taxed. Legally. It was all underground and speakeasies. There was an increase in liver cirrhosis, underage drinking. It was a real mess for this country. But we're not the only ones that had problems with it. Russia actually tried to do the same thing, and it caused the downfall of the Russian Empire. So today we're going to watch the History Guy channel. Check him out. It's called Prohibition and the Fall of the Russian Empire. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and get right on into that. I apologize, by the way, my throat is a little sore this morning, but we're going to struggle through and we're going to watch this video.
When we use the word Prohibition, Americans tend to think about that period in our history between 1920 and 1933 when we banned the production, importation, transportation, and sale of alcohol. But many Americans don't realize that Prohibition wasn't just an American thing, it was a worldwide movement. We weren't even the first to do it. In 1914, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia proclaimed his empire dry, a response to a new period of modern warfare. And despite the best hopes of Tsarist Russia, Prohibition in the empire, if anything, turned out to be even more a disaster there than it was here in the United States. It's history that deserves to be remembered. The United States actually passed a national prohibition law prior to the 18th Amendment. The 1918 Temporary Wartime Prohibition Act banned the sale of alcoholic beverages having an alcohol.
I'm sorry to interrupt so soon, but I love old maps and old newspapers. They are just beautiful the way they're done. And the artistry and the talent that went into actually creating the printing press and then actually printing newspapers is fascinating to me. Anyway, I just thought I'd put that out there because every time I see one, I'm just like, wow, that's beautiful.
Alcohol content of greater than 1.28% and was justified as a measure to save grain for producing food during the Great War. Its passage was part of the growing movement that would eventually result in the 18th Amendment. Prohibition in Imperial Russia was similarly related to wartime measures. Russia's most famous liquor, of course, is vodka. The origins of vodka are debated, and the earliest versions were considerably less alcoholic, tasted nothing like modern vodka, and were used mostly as medicine. It wasn't until the 8th century invention of the still that vodka became more alcoholic. The first written mention of the drink comes from a recorder of deeds in the Palatinate of Sandomierz in what is today Poland in 1405, from which it made its way to Russia. According to legend, a monk in the Moscow Kremlin came up with the first recipe for Russian vodka, which was originally called bread wine, but with many names reflecting quality, alcohol content, and other varieties. Over the centuries, the Russian state maintained a monopoly over the production of vodka and widely promoted its drinking. This helped to make vodka the drink of choice among Russians. In 1863, reforms included with the emancipation of the serfs changed the system, which led to much wider production and a crash in vodka prices, making it widely available to even the poorest citizens. The repeal of the monopoly also allowed the state to tax vodka sales, which became a vital part of the government finances. Traditions sprung up regarding the drink, and it became the single most important item in the peasantry's festival diet. It was a basic ingredient of all celebrations and a sort of a seal of ceremonials. It was also given to soldiers as part of their ration, which would become something of an issue later on.
It's interesting because when I went to Russia, we flew into Moscow, and we spent some time in Moscow, the Red Square. We went up to Chelny and Novgorod, and there is vodka literally on every table that you go to. People from 16 and up drink vodka like it's water. It was a very interesting experience.
At the turn of the 20th century, the imperial ambitions of Japan ran into Russia's own interests in the Far East. Specifically, Russia wanted a warm water port on the Pacific Ocean, which could be operational year-round. Their base at Vladivostok could only be operational during the summer. Since 1897, Russia had leased a base at Port Arthur from China, giving them the port their Eastern Navy needed. Japan saw Russia's interests in the region as a threat to their efforts to establish a sphere of influence throughout Korea and Manchuria. When Japan offered to recognize Russia's influence in Manchuria in exchange for recognition that Korea fell into Japan's sphere, Russia refused, and negotiations broke down in 1904. On February 9th, 1904, the Japanese Navy launched a surprise attack on the Russian Eastern Fleet at Port Arthur. Japan's attack caught the Russians off guard, and while the initial battles were indecisive, it was becoming quickly clear it would not be a short or easy war as the Russians had believed. The most decisive land battle of the war was fought in 1905, south of the city of Mudkin, today known as Shenyang. It was possibly the largest battle in history up to that point, involving some 610,000 combatants. The Russians outnumbered the Japanese, but were badly defeated. Reports were that alcohol, and vodka specifically, had helped to bring the Russian army down. Papers in St. Petersburg reported that the Japanese found several thousand Russian soldiers so dead drunk that they were able to bayonet them like so many pigs. War correspondents wrote that in the retreat, beastly drunk soldiers lost their rifles, shouted songs, and fell down and rolled in the dust. In Vienna, another paper said that the Japanese did not conquer, but alcohol triumphed. And that was...
Russia, you still haven't gotten any better today. Leave Ukraine alone.
The only place where vodka seemed to have caused a problem. All over the country, peasant conscription, often done at the point of a gun, turned into drunken riots, where buildings were burned and recruitment officers killed. Defeats at sea prompted Russia to send the Baltic fleet around the world to fight the Japanese Navy. Led by Grand Duke Alexei Alexandrovich Romanov, known for spending less time on the fleet than he did on drinking bouts and various affairs, the fleet ran into trouble before it even got out of Europe, when it mistook British fishing trawlers for Japanese torpedo boats in the North Sea between Denmark and England. The paranoid Russians killed several fishermen. The incident nearly brought England and Russia to war. One reporter wrote that the belief was confidently expressed that the only possible explanation was to be found in the undisciplined and probable drunken frenzy of the Russian naval officers. It's not clear that the sailors were actually drunk, but rumors that the Japanese had sent ships to Europe were commonplace, and the sailors were so poorly disciplined and trained that they fired several more times on innocent ships. The Baltic fleet was defeated spectacularly by the Japanese when it finally arrived. It was clear that alcohol played a role in the defeat of Imperial Russia's mighty armies. It wasn't even a new complaint. As early as the 1870s, some officers were concerned about the ill effects of alcohol. A Dr. Surovov advocated for withholding the vodka ration, claiming that troop morale, comportment, discipline, and performance would all be improved. Social drinking made drinkers out of non-drinking recruits. One group, conscripted in 1878, had 43% refusing the ration, and only 10% drinking more than the ration on the side. 5 years later, that same group was drinking much more. Only 7% refused the ration, and more than half were drinking more than just the ration. Perhaps surprisingly, statistically, the Russians actually drank less than France and Italy, but when the Russians did drink, they did it to excess. The worldwide temperance movement had been growing throughout the 1800s, and by 1890, temperance groups in Russia were calling to have vodka removed from the Russian military altogether, but many in the Russian military believed that vodka improved morale and even had medicinal effects. Imperial Navy commanders argued that naval life sometimes calls for a level of energy that could only be gained by a glass of vodka. Europe was shocked that an imperial power could be defeated by upstart Easterners, and they saw alcohol as the cause. Kaiser Wilhelm II announced in 1910 that the winner of the next European war would be the army that remained the most sober. The problem remained, however, that the Russian state relied on the taxes from vodka. But after Russia's defeat by Japan, Tsar Nicholas traveled the country, and with great grief, he witnessed sad pictures of infirmity, family poverty, and neglected businesses, the inevitable consequences of life that is other than sober. In January of 1914, the Tsar appointed a new finance minister, who he directed to make the treasury no longer dependent on the ruination of the spiritual and economic forces of the majority of my faithful subjects. That is, no longer reliant on tax revenue from vodka. The beginning of World War I and Russia's entrance in July and August of that year hastened the Tsar's plans. He banned the sale of vodka in districts of mobilization and at the front, in the hopes of preserving food stocks and, more importantly, to ease mobilization, hoping to avoid the drunken riots that accompanied mobilization in 1904. The ban has been cited as helpful in driving relatively quick mobilization in Russia, but tensions remained high. The poorest conscripts were unable to buy vodka, but the wealthy were still able to drink from their wine cellars, and despite the ban, conscripts still rioted at mobilization points, ransacking closed liquor stores. One governor...
That's the same way now, even in Russia today. There are a lot of nice things to be had in Russia, but you have to have a lot of money to get it. But that's just, I guess that's the same way in this country too. But I mean, people live to a higher standard here, and we have a lot of choices that they don't have in Russia. So really it hasn't changed at all. If you had money there in Russia then, as is today, you would have a lot of nice things.
Begged the Tsar to sell alcohol for 2 hours a day to avoid bloody clashes. The fateful moment that would lead to full prohibition in Russia was on September 27th, 1914. The Russian army was chasing retreating Germans on the Lithuanian front when platoon commander Prince Oleg Konstantinovich Romanov was shot. Oleg was Tsar Nicholas's cousin, son of his favorite uncle, Grand Duke Constantine. Oleg would die of his wounds, the only Romanov to die in battle during the war, and the Duke was deeply affected. Constantine was a teetotaler and supported Prohibition. Shortly after his son's death, the Tsar sent a telegram that announced that he had decided to abolish forever the government sale of vodka in Russia. Russia became the first country to implement Prohibition on Earth, but it came with dire consequences. The sudden ban turned many against the Tsar, and instantly an illegal liquor industry exploded. Over 1,800 illegal distilleries were found that year, and 5,707 were uncovered in 1915.
People want their booze.
The loss of revenue would be disastrous, but the Russian elite treated it with perhaps typical care. The Russian Prime Minister wrote, "So what if we do lose 800 million rubles in revenue? We shall print that much paper money. It's all the same to the people." It was not the same. Hyperinflation would be one of the drivers of the revolution that led to the dethroning of the Tsar in 1917. The head of the legislature's finance committee boasted that never since the dawn of human history has a single country, in time of war, renounced the principal source of its revenue, as if that was something to boast about. The government created fully fictitious reports claiming that productivity leaped following the ban, while printing paper money hastened a spiral of inflation which burdened the entire country. Abroad, British politician David Lloyd George called it the single greatest act of national heroism. To say that Prohibition caused the downfall of the Russian Empire is to oversimplify the situation, but in general, historians point to three important factors in the Tsardom's fall: discontent with Nicholas, hyperinflation, and the breakdown of Russia's infrastructure. Of course, vodka was at that point an enormous part of Russian culture, cutting it out amidst the largest war in history to that point, when the Tsar had few supporters. The government made inflation worse by printing paper money, and even infrastructure was affected as vodka distilleries tried to ship their entire supplies of alcohol to ports, where it could be shipped to countries that could drink it. Meant to save grain for food, instead grain was taken to make moonshine, helping to cause food shortages that bred protests. Dozens of other issues would combine to lead to the collapse of the Russian Empire. Nicholas stayed at the front, while general strikes and riots roiled the home front. The Russians were doing badly in battle, and some 1.7 million were killed in the war. Men had been taken away from the farms, and food prices soared. And between the severe winter and the continual breakdown of locomotives, supplies couldn't be moved. Police and soldiers fired upon rioting civilians. In St. Petersburg, then known as Petrograd, the garrison sided with the mobs. On March 15th, 1917, Tsar Nicholas II was forced to abdicate his throne. His family would be held during the few months of the provisional government, which would fall in October 1917 with the rise of the Bolsheviks and Vladimir Lenin. Lenin would pull Russia out of the war, eventually signing a treaty in 1918 with the Central Powers. But though the provisional government and Lenin massively changed Russian policy, one thing all three maintained was prohibition. Lenin opposed excessive drinking on ideological terms and said that we should not follow the example of the capitalist countries and put vodka and other intoxicants on the market because, profitable though they are, they will lead us back to capitalism. He took violent measures against moonshiners in order to preserve grain to feed the masses, vital in ensuring their loyalty. But Russia's experiment with prohibition ended with Lenin's death in 1924. Stalin revived the old monopoly of the Tsars to profit the state. Of course, Russia wasn't the only country to experiment with prohibition in the era. Iceland, Finland, Norway, Canada, and of course the United States would all pass some version of national prohibition in roughly the same era, virtually all of which were mostly repealed within just a few years. Historians will continue to argue over the many causes of the fall of the Russian Empire, but Russian prohibition is certainly indicative of many of the problems of the era. It showed how out of step the Russian elite were with the people, and the decision to cut essentially a third of your national revenues just as you are entering a large war is very indicative of the ill-informed and ill-timed decisions that were part of the reason that Russia fared so poorly in that war. So while prohibition was certainly not the only cause, it's difficult to discount Russian prohibition as being a major factor in the fall of the Romanov dynasty. It's just another example about how Russian culture and history is inextricably linked to vodka. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the History Guide, short snippets of forgotten history. And if you did enjoy, feed the algorithm by making a comment or clicking that like button.
Great video. I like this guy. This is absolutely the first video I have seen the History Guy do. Please visit his channel, visit thehistoryguy.net. He's got a lot of great information. Alcohol is a problem, and I think everyone who has tried prohibition have done it for what they believed was moral reasons. The problem was, in my opinion, then as now, people like to wind down their day with a good drink. It happens. And when you try to tell people what they can do and when they can do it, how they should do it, and what they can't be doing, you're going to cause trouble. I don't care what it is, whether it's alcohol, tobacco, personal freedoms, whatever it is. You can't say, oh, you can't do that anymore, because people are going to revolt. And then, of course, the United States tried it and failed. Iceland tried it and failed. It's not a good idea at all. If you feel you have a drinking problem, if you are consuming too much, if you're drinking a lot of alcohol, or you feel like it's just too much for you, if there's some red flags with your health, reach out to a friend, a family member, a church leader, alcohol abuse hotline. Get some help. Please don't drink and drive. Thank you so much for joining me for this video reaction. Again, I'm pretty new at this. I think I have like 10 videos out. I do have 3 subscribers. I'm so excited about that. Thank you so much to my subscribers. When I get to about 100 subscribers, I'm going to be starting to do giveaways, which I think you really will enjoy. Anyway, thank you so much. I'll see you next time.